Hello people and welcome to this new class in where we're gonna see a very important tool as it is the selection tool. Shortcut V key. We find it here in the first position in our main toolbar, and just on the right side we have as well the direct selection tool. They are kind of related between each other, but in this class we will focus just on this first tool. Selection tool. Once I hit it, the control bar changes and we have a lot of options. So hold yourself because this class is gonna be very deep. Let's start with the drawings we have on our page. We have a rectangle and we have a circle. I used this tool in order to draw them, and once I have them already on my page, if I wanna move it or transform them, then I have to hit V key. Selection tool is on. I can hit then the rectangle, for example, and if I click and drag, I will move it around my page or even out of my page. That is very easy. If I zoom in, you will find different reference points around my geometry, right? It happens the same as with the text boxes. The logic is the same. We have control points in every corner and in the middle of both axes, the vertical and the horizontal axis. Here you have to understand that this geometry is a rectangle and then the box container is the same as the geometry. But if I select the circle, you can see how my geometry is a circle, but the box container is still a rectangle, right? And then we have control points in every corner and in the middle of every side. Thanks to these control points, I will be able to change the scale in the vertical axis or in the horizontal axis, right? If I do Ctrl Z, then let's use the corners. If I click and drag the corners, I will transform my geometry in both axes, in both dimensions. And furthermore, if I wanna make this geometry bigger in both dimensions and at the same time keep the proportions, then I have to click and drag while I am holding Shift key. Here we are. Let's do the same with the rectangle. Click and drag from one corner, then I hold Shift key and my transformation is being doing proportional. When I am happy, I release first the mouse, then Shift key, and here we are. Imagine now that we want to keep that transformation proportionally, but at the same time we want to keep the center of the geometry as well. How can we do that? Then we have to use a little bit more sophisticated combination. I select my geometry, I click and drag from one corner, and then I hold Shift key as before, plus Alt key as well. Then I drag and I can choose the new size of my geometry, keeping the proportions and the center. Then I release first the mouse, then Shift and Alt key, and here we are. So summing up, you have to keep in mind that Shift key is for making perfect things. Let's call it like that, perfect. We want to keep the proportions. We don't want something kind of bumpy or not regular. So Shift, perfect things, and Alt to keep the center. To keep the center of our geometries. So by far we are talking all the time about transformation, right? We are transforming our geometries. We can transform them or we can move them thanks to this tool. And both things can be done manually or using specific numbers. If we want to be completely accurate and precise, then we'll have to use the tools we have up here. These tools are the same as the specific panel called transformation. If I expand this window menu and I'll go to Object and Layout, here we find Align, Pathfinder, and Transform. This panel is the same as the options we find on the control menu when the selection tool is already hit. So it is up to you, use one or another. My personal advice here is to use the control bar. So I'll close this panel, and then with the rectangle already selected, we can check first of all this diagram in where the reference point is marked on the upper left corner, right? We can change that reference point easily just by hitting on our desired point. And actually this tool will help us a lot in the future, so keep it in mind. Then we find references related with the position, x-axis and y-axis, horizontal and vertical axis. These measurements are taken accordingly with the reference point. So if our reference point is in the middle of the page, this distance is 1, but if I change the reference point, then you can see how everything varies, right? So if we start taking as a reference point the upper left corner, that means our upper left corner of our rectangle is the one which is marking the distance from that single point to the 0 point of the page. And the 0 point of the page always is the upper left corner of our page. We can see it on our rules, 0 and 0. In both axes. So now, if I place my rectangle there, distance either on the x-axis or in the y-axis is 0. If I move my rectangle to the middle point of this A4, then x is 105 millimeters, right? And if I move it to the other corner, then x becomes 210 millimeters because our page is an A4 and y is still 0 because we are measuring from the upper left corner of our page, this point, to the upper left corner of our geometry, this point. If I change now the position of the reference point, we are changing the position of the reference point of the rectangle, of our geometry. Let's put it here. Then x measurement now is bigger because we have 1/2 more of the rectangle, right? And if I click this reference point, then it's even bigger because we are measuring the distance now between this point and this another point, from here to here. I hope it's clear. I will place my rectangle again on my page. Reference point, normally I use the upper left corner or the middle point. Take in mind that everything that I have just explained related with the x dimension is the same when we are talking about the y-axis, the vertical dimension. So let's jump to these other boxes. Here we are talking about the width and the height. Of course, the width and height of the selected geometry. In this case, we are talking about this rectangle. The width now is 88.121 millimeters and the height this one. If I change the scale, now I am using this middle point to make it higher. You can see how the height is changing on here, right? So as I told you, when we need specific numbers, let's say for example that we want our rectangle to be 100 millimeters high, then instead of doing manually, it's much better to use these controls and then increase a little bit by clicking twice the height from here. And still, of course, we can move it and align it to the center of the page using the intelligent guides. The same happens with the circle. I will select the circle and then the width and the height is talking about the width and the height of this circle. And to be more precise, it's talking about the width and the height of the container box. So be careful about that. If I reduce the width, then the circle is not a circle anymore. It has become into an ellipse. And in case we want to be super precise, we can use this transformation panel and say, for example, our width is going to be 90 millimeters and our height is going to be 150. When the increments are bigger, I recommend you to use the Shift key, hold it and click, and then our increments will be 10 by 10. And here we are, 150, the height of this geometry. Don't forget that you can use this chain in order to constrain the proportions. It is exactly the same as when we used before the Shift key to constrain proportions. If we hit it here, then when we increase or decrease either the width or the height, the other dimension is affected and changes proportionally. Don't forget here that the reference point is key. If we are talking about the width and we make increments using the specific box, I hold Shift key and I make the width bigger and bigger. As far as the reference point is placed in the middle, my geometry varies using that reference point as an anchor point. If I select now the circle and I change the reference point and I change the height, Now the upper left corner is the anchor point, the reference point, and the high in this case is changing from that point on. Okay, time to jump to the next boxes. Here we are talking about a scale percentage. It could be either horizontal or vertical. It's more or less the same as before when we were talking about the width and the height, but this time using a percentage. So let's select the magenta rectangle and then I can expand this menu and say, instead of 100%, let's make it 50% of the width. Here we are. The anchor point, the reference point, this time was placed in the upper left corner, right? Now with the circle, I select the circle, I pay attention on where is my reference point, and then I will change the scale using a percentage, but this time along the vertical axis. So I expand the menu and let's do it like 25% of the height. And here we are. As it happened before, we have the possibility to constrain proportions for scale. And another interesting point is how the stroke has been reduced as well, not just the fill. That is something that could be changed, but we will see it later. So I will select the circle, I will constrain proportions, and I'll make this ellipse double the size, 200. And here we are. If we want to keep the center, the best option is to mark the reference point here in the middle. Then again, 150% bigger, and the center has not been moved. It's still here. Good. Let's jump to the next. Rotation angle. Easy. Our ellipse is selected, and then we can rotate it from here using a specific number or manually using the corners and the little screen indicator next to it. We can as well shear the angle. I select my rectangle and then look how this tool works. So transformation panel is super useful. Let's do the process in a reverse mode. I select this ellipse and then I check the transformation panel. I see that some number is written down here, 8.5 rotation, and then I put it 0 again, because everything is registered on these little boxes. To finish with the class, let's focus on these different tools. We are talking here about rotation. Rotate 90 degrees clockwise, rotate 90 degrees anti-clockwise. Very intuitive. I can hit it once and over again in both directions. It is the same as the rotation tool before, but using increments of 90 degrees. Then down here we have flip horizontal and flip vertical. This is for doing symmetries. Let's select this rectangle, then I can use the flip horizontal tool, one click, and here we are. If I want to reverse, I hit it again, and if I wanna use the flip vertical tool, then one click on here and one click on here. We cannot appreciate so good the differences, but look, because when I hit, for example, flip vertical, this little P letter changes and is giving us the clue about how our geometry is affected by the tool. If I want to reverse, I click again and letter P says not flipped. If I hit the horizontal flip, then it's more obvious when we check the position of the letter, but if we hover over it, we can read flipped horizontally. So we will never be lost. Well, if we continue moving to the right, we are already covering new tools not related with the transformation tools. So time to say goodbye, and I hope to see you in the next class.